So, Gary Frank. Gary Frank is an adjunct member of the Dossiter Health Ethics Center. He has worked as a nurse consultant and palliative care resource nurse at the Royal Alexandra Hospital and University of Alberta Hospital. He's been a friend as well as adjunct member for the Dossiter Center for many years, supportive of our work there. It's with great pleasure that I pass you on now to him. Thank you for being here, Gary.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for everyone who's listening in. So why health ethics education? And looking at, if it's possible, how we do it. And just give me 1 second. I'm having trouble advancing the slides for some reason, which I practiced, but there we go. Okay. Yeah, so why this topic? Well, it's good to ask questions about fundamental things that we're involved in. This is me looking for Carol's office at the Dossiter Institute, in case you're wondering. And it's just that it's been crossing my mind a lot, to be honest with you, and running into students, which I still do from time to time, and staff who are asking questions. I wonder, am I doing the best I can when it comes to topics of health ethics in the clinical setting, which is my work world still. And it's as simple as that. Well, having said that, I'm not really looking at a sort of technical pedagogical session today. It's some practical things come up, hopefully, especially near the end, but it's reflecting on what we're doing and the foundations of it philosophically, and what the academic community has to say about that to some extent, at least to the degree that I've been able to look into that. So I hope you find it of some interest and relevance. So we'll look at what health ethics is. We'll also use the term bioethics a lot, which is actually a broader category having to do with ethical issues in biology outside of health, but it's used so often in the ethical literature related to healthcare that it just is often used interchangeably, and that will happen in this talk. Is health ethics something that can actually be taught? And if so, what's the best way to go about that? What are models of health ethics and health ethics education? So look at the role of principles, which is in history of the last 40 years, quite significant. Values, virtues, and then I want to look at narratives and how our understanding of narratives is important in the way we approach health ethics and its teaching. And a little bit on decision analysis, which is also an interesting thing when it comes to bias, although I don't have too much on that. And then some of the terms with which people self-identify, academics and others, when they're talking about how they approach health ethics, we will also look at, like those that consider themselves to be followers of Immanuel Kant's school of thought and Aristotle, and utilitarians, and pragmatists, psychologists, and then artists as well, poets and storytellers. What is health ethics? So it's interesting. When I Googled, just because that's what one does these days, for a definition of health ethics, there wasn't that much coming up. And I realize it sometimes depends on the algorithms that Google gives you, but there was an interesting thing from one sector of the World Health Organization. And then there was our dear John Dossiter Health Ethics Center's definition, which I think is as good as any. I'm not sure who wrote it, but thank you for doing that. So let's just have a quick look at that. Health ethics looks at moral issues involved in our understanding of life. In health ethics, we ask questions such as, when does life begin? How should it continue? And when does it end? Often we think of health ethics and its relationship with healthcare, medicine, and human values. Ethics is the attempt to think carefully and systematically about our options, then choose the best possible course of action. Consider everything that is at stake for everybody affected, not just the most obvious implications, and especially not just our own interests. Balance different values and perspectives, as there is rarely a perfect answer. Focus on profoundly important matters such as respect, fairness, and compassion. Ask better questions than we've asked before about our options and values. And I'm trying to do that last one in particular in terms of myself, is just ask questions that I find helpful, for me anyway. So 43 years ago, I guess, 45, wow, time flies by. The first edition of this, which I happen to have right beside me from the library, Beauchamp and Childress's, Tom Beauchamp, James Childress's textbook, Principles of Biomedical Ethics, was published, and now it's in its 8th edition, probably due for another one pretty soon if they keep on their timeline. And it's really focused on fundamental principles, and it's like I said, a foundational text in any instruction having to do with bioethics and health ethics. And of course, we hear primarily actually a discussion of autonomy, and for good reason. It's crucial. Respect for autonomy is obviously a crucial principle in health ethics. And then also non-maleficence, beneficence, so not doing harm, doing good. And then justice in terms of the communal issues involved, and how they relate to individual questions at hand, of course. The textbook has developed in its different editions over the year. There's seems to me a bit more on virtue ethics, and I find that really interesting. And actually, I'll mention some things later where Childress has commented and seems to have changed his perspective a bit on virtue ethics, which is interesting. And then there's more on the common morality theory of how the morality of the community at large is relevant. And that's clearly important. And the whole question of how the ethos and the moralities of the different professional communities and the community at large relate is crucial. We're going to look at that shortly. The issue I'm always having is in a pluralistic society, which is something I value very much, I think is crucial to respecting human rights and autonomy, et cetera, and the rights of minority communities and all communities. But how do we come up with a common morality? And that's an ongoing question. Okay, I have entitled these next few slides as Medicine and Moralizing, partly just because I like alliteration, but also because I think it brings out some pertinent aspects of this question that I was just referring to. Is there an internal morality for medicine to start? So let's look at that. So, and for the health professions in general. Do the health professions have their own internal morality that can guide decisions adequately? In other words, this is the way I think of it. Can the professions develop while maintaining their foundational values? Should they? Or are they simply civil servants, to put it in an extreme, what to me is an extreme description, although there's lots of ethicists seriously proposing this, that the health professions and health professionals are merely civil servants of the larger society's interests, and therefore its ethos is and morality is really defined by the history, culture, and politics, solely by the history, culture, and politics of the larger society. And then how that morality comes to be is the question. And then the whole question of leadership from the professions is always there. So, and is this the case regardless of how corrosive that influence may be? And I don't want to be negative about the larger society and the polity, but we do have to accept that that influence is not always necessarily going to be positive. And then what is the role of professional colleges in this regard, which I keep asking myself lately. I think I've done it during question period and a few other sessions too, some excellent ones that have occurred lately, because to me it's crucial, but I don't know if I'm hearing much from them, to be honest with you. And if I'm missing it, let me know, please. An interesting review of this topic from 20-something years ago, but still is in the Journal of Medicine Philosophy, and it's by John Harris. It's called A Method in Search of a Purpose, the Internal Morality of Medicine. As far as the feeling of some writers and ethicists, clinical ethicists in this field, just look at a few. The first two, Edmund Pellegrino and Robert Veitch, I recall actually back in the Provincial Health Ethics Network classes with Victoria. I think we had phone interviews with both of them, which was pretty cool. This is back in the phone interview days. But anyway, Edmund Pellegrino is a strong proponent of virtue ethics, and also of the idea that there is an internal morality present in the practice of medicine itself. And in order to ensure that's positive influence, I suppose you could say, the virtues need to be modeled in mentoring. The virtues necessary for the competent practice of the profession. Robert Veitch, on the other hand, says no profession has an internal morality. All professional mores come from the external morality of the society at large. John Harris tries to come up with a more middle of the road approach, saying, well, there is an internal morality to the professions in a limited sense. For example, in medicine, the idea of maintaining confidentiality could be considered an aspect of an internal morality. I think there should be an internal morality, although the historical abuses at certain times, especially in the wars, and hence the Nuremberg Code, which in many ways, although it was primarily regarding medical research, is in many ways a founding document of modern bioethics. So there should be an internal code, but it's a reasonable question to ask, how is that maintained, developed, and what is the relationship between it and external society, and how, if virtues are needed to maintain ethical standards, which I think they are, how is that developed in both the society at large and the professions? I mean, the society at large sounds like asking that is an unrealistic question, but my point is, you know, as I think I've said before in my last talk on the whole social contract thing between the health professions and society, I mean, what is our role in terms of leading in terms of values with the society at large? That's the question I'm asking. The other thing is that it seems to me that in the history of medicine and the health sciences itself, there's a dynamic that's important when we start looking at the whole question of morality, because I do think that the history of medicine and the health sciences, and to some extent science overall, is to help move us away from models of problem solving for human problems such as disease that are overly moralistic. Now, of course, that moving away has two sides to it, right? You can move too far and just stop thinking about morality at all. But on the other hand, as Hippocrates, 2,500 years ago, pointed out, the moralistic view of disease, for example, is not helpful. So this is a pretty famous document in the history of medicine on the sacred disease, which is the term used, at least in this kind of Victorian translation, for epilepsy. So let's just take a second here to look at this, because I think it highlights an important point. It is thus with regard to the disease called sacred. It appears to me to be no wise more divine nor more sacred than other diseases, but has a natural cause. Men regard its nature and cause as divine from ignorance and wonder. And this notion of its divinity is kept up by their inability to comprehend it. They who first refer this malady to the gods appear to me to have been just such persons as the conjurers, purificators, mountebanks, which I looked up and means con men basically, and charlatans now are, who give themselves out for being excessively religious and as knowing more than other people. Such persons then, using the divinity as a pretext and screen of their own ability to afford any assistance, have given out that the disease is sacred, adding suitable reasons for this opinion. They have instituted a mode of treatment which is safe for themselves. So People can, in order to oversimplify, whether for self-interested or just because they can't handle uncertainty, reduce things to moralistic categories or other categories, which we'll look at in a second, in a way that's just not helpful. This reminds me of contemporary problems with basically charlatans, such as Tim Caulfield from the Health Ethics Institute has highlighted often. A more recent discussion of the moralizing of disease and the victim blaming for illness is in a nice little, very literary, poetic work from late 70s, 1978 by Susan Sontag, The Illness of Metaphor, The Illness as Metaphor. I can think, and we probably all run into this when sometimes in discussions of obesity, including among health professionals and addiction, for example, like I was suggesting already, there's this tendency for some to reduce complex problems to one-dimensional paradigms. Let's start with the moral paradigm, just so we can feel like we have a hold on it. And, so I've heard people go on about the sin of gluttony as basically the beginning and the end of the story of the obesity problem, which is, clearly oversimplified and judgmental and quite annoying when you hear someone discuss that, because it's not helpful. If they really cared about the problem, they'd be looking at health promotion, for example. Same with addiction in different ways. And a less serious example, if you've ever talked to anyone, as I have, about gout, because occasionally I get the gout attacks, you better be prepared in many instances to get a lecture, if they've even heard of the thing, about the disease of kings and the lifestyle of Henry VIII. So this sort of tendency to oversimplify for the sake of judgment is there in both serious and less serious instances. On the other hand, we can reduce things to a one-dimensional biological paradigm, which then excludes all question of moral responsibility, but is also not necessarily accurate, because it's reducing complex human problems to one dimension. And then we say, okay, here's your drug and go away. You don't need any interdisciplinary multidimensional approach, which is not going to be helpful in many cases. This, I think, is just a lack of moral vision, which we'll talk about a bit in a few more minutes. So I better keep moving here. When we get to the question of philosophical theories, which is important, there's a lot of discussion about not getting overly committed to one theory. I'm going to skip over the Toolman point because of time. I want to keep on track, but it's a great book if you can get around to it ever. And I'm just going to go right into the next point, which seems to be the consensus lately among moral philosophers, or at least more and more prevalent among moral philosophers. I shouldn't use words like consensus so easily, but there's many moral philosophers suggesting that really the way to approach theory for ethics and bioethics in particular is to take the best you can from all the theories and don't get wedded too much to one theory, because it will narrow your view in an unrealistic and unhelpful way. So Nora Hamlin, and this ethicist from Norway, I think, in her article, Is Moral Theory Harmful in Practice, puts it this way. She talks about a box of tools approach. There's no reason to reject moral theory if theories are considered as tools in a box rather than attempts at formulating authoritative pictures of reality. What I suggest is a view of moral theory where different approaches are seen as enriching each other, and practical conflicts are approached from a multiplicity of angles, and that includes more than just theories, but even in terms of theories, more than one theory. So let's look at some theories. If you look at the textbooks, you come up often with Kantian deontology or rule-based principalist kind of theory, utilitarian theory, and then sometimes I'll mention virtue theory, and others. But this is because utilitarianism is mentioned so often, and I find this formula from the early days of utilitarianism fascinating. Although we're not going to spend too much time on it. I just thought we should have a quick look at utilitarianism. I'm not going to spend any time on this calculus. Actually, as you know, utilitarianism is an attempt to weigh goods versus negatives, pleasures versus pains, and come up with the best solution in any given situation. The other reason I put this up here is that in my family, we have a very intuitive felicific calculator, and her name is Felicity, funnily, and she's my 6-year-old granddaughter, and she will tell you clearly and more quickly than this formula what is pleasure and what is pain. All right, enough of that. This is an interesting book, Against Bioethics, catchy title, by a psychologist who's a consequentialist utilitarian, name of Jonathan Barron, and who's an advocate of really looking at decision analysis, although he seems to be talking more about broad social policy than actual individual case clinical bioethics sort of setting, but it's still worth looking at. Barron has argued that many of the real decisions that appeal to bioethics for their justification are influenced by intuitive heuristics or rules and biases, which arise without much reflection about ultimate purposes and justifications. So that's important, because, and we're going to look more at biases later. The intuitive appeal to bioethical principles leads to a kind of disproportionate penny-wise and pound-foolish emphasis on minor problems involving flat maxima, while ignoring major problems such as the problems of the poor. I've argued that a different approach to these problems will yield better outcomes overall. The different approach involves the application of decision analysis based on consequences, which I call utilitarian decision analysis, because it adds up changes in utility over people. I thus advocate greater reliance on experts in decision analysis, which I think is a good point. Bioethics will not be so much a matter of telling us what desires we ought to have. In particular, it will not be about telling us that our desires to live long or to reproduce, whatever it takes to do so, are false. So, interesting. And the thing is, the question I can still never get around, and if anyone can enlighten me, please do, with utilitarianism is, how do you negotiate what is clearly often the incommensurability or even incompatibility of one group's pleasures with another group's pains, just in the way that rights conflict? Like this is unavoidable, and I'm sure there is work on it, but I still can't see how we get around it as a fundamental flaw. And then who are the losers, in those situations? I mean, to be accurate, almost always the utilitarians have a strong concern for the poor. So they're not just sort of going with the flow in terms of the victims. But I still have these questions. Okay, I almost cut out the slides on Parfit because there's no way that I've read his 5 volumes. He's a moral philosopher who just died a few years ago and is very influential with many. And I'm reading his biography. He's a very interesting guy, and I read some short summaries of his work and a couple of short excerpts on articles by him. So I decided to just leave him in for the sake of it, in a way. What's interesting is he is also a sort of box of tools guy when it comes to theory, although he's pretty strong on the utilitarian side. He's definitely not a relativist. In fact, it seems like he gets really disturbed at the idea that there would be no meaning to anything if objective moral reality didn't exist. And after tons of work, very rigorous work, especially when it comes to Kant, from what I've read of others' analysis of it, he concludes that there are real moral standards of true and false, good and bad, and they're kind of like mathematical equations, which is interesting. So I'm going to leave that as is, then look at what he says quickly, that Kantism, Kantianism, utilitarianism, and contractarianism all point to the same answers to moral questions. He kind of, based on reliable sources from a friend of mine who's an academic, he touches a bit on Aristotle, but really doesn't pay much attention to virtue ethics. And to me, that's kind of a shame, but there we are. The other thing that comes across, even in the short articles that I've read, and he works hard, he's brilliant. So I guess it's a occupational risk, but he kind of comes across sometimes like I don't know if you know the Grand Inquisitor story. I came across it in Dostoevsky, the brothers Karamazov. It's kind of a story within a novel. And there, what happens is Jesus comes and visits this archbishop in medieval Seville, Spain. And the archbishop says, "Oh, it's okay, Jesus, just keep quiet. We've got it all figured out. And don't tell the masses what the real gospel is, because it's just going to mess everything up." And there is this, and the bishop isn't being a selfish, self-interested, corrupt person. Well, he's corrupt in some ways, obviously, but it's more that he thinks this is better for the common good, right? To just hush hush on what the gospel actually preaches, the Christian gospel. Well, there is this instance in Parfit where he goes through this long thing of, well, Reason in Persons, a 2-volume poem about the basically unreality of the self, kind of like Buddhist. And the way this pertains to policy, he feels would be negative in terms of outcome. So he says, don't tell people this. I'm oversimplifying. It's more than just the non-reality of the self. But anyway, because we don't know yet enough about what the real principles are, I failed to find a principle, as the first sentence says, to make really responsible, unrisky or less risky decisions. Well, the first question that comes to mind is, shouldn't you really be looking at your theory if it's too dangerous to tell anybody? So anyway, just in my simplistic, non-specialist mind, that's what occurs to me. I suppose if you're looking at physics, like Oppenheimer or Einstein, you could say, yeah, in hindsight, maybe it would have been better if they hadn't told anybody. But it seems to me that's a little different than ethics, not to mention impossible. This idea of epistemic injustice is so important, and epistemic justice, and it's come up in our sessions for sure, especially this year with the equity, inclusion, diversity talks. And basically, I just want to mention it because I think it's quite relevant to the way we look at cases, which I want to get to shortly. So all I want to talk about from Miranda Fricker's book is testimonial injustice. What is it? It's to discount the credibility of the statement based on the identity of the speaker. I've got here, otherwise known as rank prejudice, because basically that's what it is. You don't listen to the credibility of argument from someone because you identify them as coming from a group that, in your view, you're not interested in, or it doesn't have credibility. But this is not a valid approach to evaluating arguments, is it? And it's unjust. And then hermeneutical injustice is more of a systemic, institutional thing. It's the harm caused to a person when they have an experience, but do not have the concepts or frameworks they need to make sense of what that experience is, of what their experience is. There's a link there that discusses this more in a very clear way, which is helpful. One example would be a victim of sexual harassment in a social context where an understanding of sexual harassment doesn't exist. What do we do? I can't help but say again that I think the first thing is to cultivate virtues of openness and non-judgmental attitude in both these regards, and then to actually take initiatives like the equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives to institutionalize those virtues. All right. Another approach, again, regarding epistemology, or how we approach the validity of knowledge hence the adjective epistemic, is this really interesting book, which I just learned is now in its second edition, called Uncertain Bioethics. And I really like this approach because I think admitting uncertainty is so important. 1 second, please. So Stephen Napier is engaging in a skeptical study about judgments on the permissibility of killing. And he focuses on the nature of moral cognition, and particularly its uncertainty. And really, he ends up saying, if in doubt, we should err on side of the caution. And that when it comes to questions of killing, there is a lot of moral uncertainty, and therefore we need epistemic humility. And we need to appreciate that important factors are unknown or uncertain, especially when there's a high cost for being wrong, which clearly, when you're talking about killing people, there is. Yes, this relates to my perennial concern about MAID legislation, which I think at the moment, in any case, is an example of epistemic hubris or just epistemic indifference, because we don't know enough and to be going on with this expansion of MAID legislation. As already said, assuming that certainty exists when it does not can lead to reckless action and policy. The expansion of medical assistance in dying to include people solely suffering from mental illness, and the systems need to move forward towards readiness in 2 years, as our federal Minister of Health has put it. Suggests that it's merely a question of bureaucratic inertia, and the question of why this inertia exists isn't asked. Yeah, bureaucracies are slow and inefficient, blah, blah, blah. But this is not just about bureaucratic inertia. This is about major cultural conflict. I don't see how you can get around this. Our health professions have been for centuries working on the premise of the sanctity of life, which we almost never hear uttered anymore. And we're saying that this is just about bureaucratic inertia and that you better hop to it, professionals. This is our external morality. Where did that come from, by the way? And you better just get ready to kill people who aren't dying. And yes, I'm being blunt, but tell me more, because I can't see any other take on this at the moment. Yes, I know people are suffering, but there are so many specialists in the field that have concerns about this that we really need to do more than just say, oh, the bureaucracy needs a bit more time. That's my opinion. Sorry. I'm not sorry, but if I'm wrong, I'm open to input. Thanks. There. That's my major value judgment of the day, I promise. And so then, should we just not get too excited about principles and epistemology and then just look at pragmatism? And, pragmatism is a sophisticated school of thought, but I don't think it's the answer to everything. Again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to read this entire text. One of these days, I'm going to make my presentations have a little less text. I'm just going to skip to the last line, which is a little too cute, maybe, as Bertrand Russell sometimes was, but I'm going to read it anyway because I think it's a valid point. We should not forget the sage observation of Bertrand Russell. Pragmatism is like a warm bath that heats up so imperceptibly that you don't know when to scream. Because it can be short-sighted, I think, is the point. Anyway, again, I'm probably kind of wrong there, but that's for the sake of that important school, my perspective on it at the moment. Okay, I really wanted to look at the use of cases. I love this book. I think we're going to have enough time to just get this done and then have a reasonable amount of time for questions. So I want to look at a sort of literary approach to our practice of health ethics and health ethics education, both in terms of literature as a supplement to philosophy and reflection on clinical practice, and also literary criticism as a critique of our approach to cases, which is a fundamental part of health ethics, right? So this book, that's what it's talking about. It's not saying that bioethics is a fiction, it doesn't exist. It's saying that one of the fundamental aspects of our work, the case, we have to recognize that it's a literary form. it's a genre that has its own characteristics and it's inevitably biased. And if we do this, we can improve on the quality of our case summaries and our understanding of the cases, and we can overcome some bias, hopefully. Interestingly, he says one of the most prevalent characteristics of this genre to date is that it is plot-driven rather than character-driven. It's more like a mystery or adventure novel than a psychological portrayal of characters and relationships. It's more like the novels of John Grisham than those of Virginia Woolf. And then he critiques, and kindly, and for our sake too, not only in his book, but also in a précis of his book that was published actually in the first volume of the American Journal of Bioethics back in 2001. He critiques this case that James Childress uses to, I was going to read the whole case, but there won't be time for that, but that's okay. I'll summarize it. Childress used this as a way of saying that virtue ethics is not valid because it can't give us any rules on how this doctor should act in this given situation. But what Chambers points out is that there was no discussion of character whatsoever in this case. And so how can you talk about virtue if you haven't actually elucidated anything about the characters involved? You can't. So in other words, we can remain too abstract if we take this approach that ignores character and virtue, and end up with biases that are not helpful. Of course, you can have bias in character analysis too, so you're never going to have an objective case study. But at least realizing that we have the tendency to just get on with the action and not understand enough about the actual people involved is important. So that's to me really worth keeping in mind. By the way, Childress took to heart this critique from Chambers, and I think it's probably integrated it into some of the subsequent editions of Principles of Biomedical Ethics. And in fact, Childress is the first person that's recommending Chambers' book. On the blurb on the back, he's highly enthusiastic about it. So that's interesting. With respect to literary criticism and literature itself, I think there is a lot we can learn from it in addition to this looking at cases as literary genres. And something that's always come to mind for me ever since I read this back in undergrad English classes from John Keats is that this is a quality that is important in more than just the arts, negative capability. He wrote this in a letter to his brothers back in 1817. Keats was a brilliant, my favorite, I think, romantic poet. It struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, as he put it in the 19th century, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean, negative capability. That is when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. This pursued through volumes would perhaps take us no further than this, that with a great poet, the sense of beauty overcomes every consideration, or rather obliterates all consideration. Now, we're not writing poems here. However, I do think being able to, let's put it this way, live with the reality of tragedy, not indifferently, obviously, we need to respond, but without oversimplifying it, is a quality that's important for health professionals and health ethics work. So let me just leave it at that for now. You can think about it if you want. So with that in mind, and with what Chambers has to say, basically, I do think there is a role for poetry and fiction in helping us think about health ethics and understand it at times, and understand our day-to-day work in it and our writing about it. It's a beautiful book here by Martha Nussbaum. If you get a chance, Self Knowledge. She's such a great writer, both philosophically and when it comes to literature. This book, again, back in my salad days, as they put it, undergrad days, in Toronto. I took a course with this Professor Fry before he wrote these books, but it was these books came out of his work actually on this course because the course was on the Bible and literature. And the point is that mythological and metaphorical language, such as we find in poetry and fiction, has a certain power that abstraction doesn't. And it's a power connected to concrete human reality. And that's all I want to say about it. I just think it's important that we remember that we're embodied beings. And I think that poetry and fiction can help us with that. Okay, the last section is on looking at biases. We've done a bit of that already. This is a great paper. It's just a summary of biases that can happen in bioethics work. And for teaching, I think it's really helpful. It's by Mr. Hoffman. And I'll just summarize that, and then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions. He lists a bunch of biases, pervasive simplifications or distortions in judgment and reasoning that systematically affect human decision-making. So that's a reasonable definition of a bias, I think. Narrative biases, as I've just discussed by looking at the work of Todd Chambers. Bias can also be related to lack of awareness of issues concerning equity, diversity, and inclusion. And there's been a lot of good work on that from our group this year via the Dossiter Institute. I really thought in terms of research that Dr. Rizicki's presentation on this topic was really helpful. And those are biases we always need to keep in mind. There are cognitive, well, whether or not this is a bit of an artificial division at times, and that may be true, but basically we can think of biases as having both cognitive aspects and affective aspects. Hoffman gives some examples such as extension bias. The more is better, more blood tests, more imaging will help. Well, not always, right? We need to look at the overall situation. Endowment effect. That is, we overvalue what we already have compared to what other alternatives are, which we'll have to spend some energy on exploring. Anchoring effect, relying too much on initial information and ignoring high quality information that may be more difficult to obtain. Again, we have to spend energy to do that. Impact bias, the tendency to overestimate the impact of a future event. Things are going to be better or worse without really assessing whether or not we're accurately estimating that. Optimism bias, pessimism bias, of course, it's related to what I just said as well. Projection bias, the inclination to think that others have the same attitude, belief, or priority as oneself, even when this is unlikely. That's human tendency, and important to remember that's not the case. And the yuck factor, which, to be honest, I have a hard time really accepting. I think I understand it, but I don't know if I accept it. It's a tendency. I do accept that it exists. It's one of those things where I can't understand why people get hung up on it. Maybe because I have a fairly strong stomach. I don't know. But in healthcare, you need to get past that. But in any case, it's a real thing for sure. It's a tendency to react to events and things and persons and problems based on the disgust of the situation. And there's a book on that. This is just a funny example of what a unfortunate and somewhat hilarious bibliographic typo can create. I spent a half an hour looking for this book called The Nature and Moral Significance of Disgust by someone named Mr. Yuck, which was just too funny to not look up, plus it was relevant. It turns out that's a typo, and the title of the book is Yuck, The Nature and Moral Significance of Disgust, and it's by a man named Daniel Kelly. All right, in conclusion, I do think health ethics is possible. I do think we need to strive for epistemic justice and epistemic humility if we're going to do a good job of educating and practicing health ethics, educating in health ethics and practicing it. We need to definitely be awareness of bias and of ways to prevent narrative bias. And then also, of course, be aware of equity, diversion, and inclusion initiatives, and just practice and integration into our character, hopefully. I think professional values as manifest in professional virtues is really important, and we need to keep this in mind continually when educating through mentorship, as we do so often as clinicians. And the colleges, I personally think, need to be a little more explicit about this. It's not easy. We're in a pluralistic society, but our professions do have values, and we need to be really clear and vocal about them, I think. And then, as you may have figured out, I kind of like this idea of practical wisdom. I haven't said that yet, or phronesis from way back from the Greeks and Aristotle in particular, of an undogmatic inclusion of theory, values, literature, character, virtues, embodied principles, however you want to put it. I really like that approach. So, and I think we need to use it. Oh, we have time for 1 minute of self-care. I think we might. I promise I'll keep it to less than a minute. This is just a sort of useful reflection in music. Now, can you hear is the question.
The audio is not coming through
Oh,
clearly,
sorry.
unfortunately.
Sorry. Okay. You know what? I'm just going to ask you to look at that. If I can get out of here. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fine. I'll just encourage you to, for enjoyment and also for useful reflection on what matters in life, look at the life of Brian Wilson, who was one of the main guys from the Beach Boys. Yeah. And here's me working on my next project. Let's just have some questions and conversation if you like. Thank you.